Buenas tardes a todos. Estamos muy contentos de que ustedes hayan tomado el tiempo de estar esta tarde aquí en el CISAN. Estamos de manteles largos. Nuevamente nos está acompañando una figura reconocida internacionalmente y que generosamente toma un poco de su tiempo y su visita a México y al IEC. Y gracias a la coordinación que hace el director del CISAN, Juan Carlos Barrón, y la doctora Alicia Girón, directora del PUEAAO, en organizar este evento. Tenemos hoy la presencia del doctor Mario Seccareccia. Ya la doctora Cynthia nos dará una breve reseña, pero espero que podamos aprovechar al máximo todo su conocimiento y toda su generosidad en tratar de explicar qué está pasando en Canadá y que de primera mano nos aclare. Muy bien, Cynthia, te doy todo el tiempo. Bienvenido y comenzamos.
Muchas gracias. Gracias a todos por su tiempo. Yo me enfoco a leer las semblanzas de la doctora Claudia y del doctor Mario. Bueno, nuestro ponente de hoy, Mario Seccareccia, es profesor emérito del Departamento de Economía de la Universidad de Ottawa, donde enseñó desde 1978 a 2018 en los campos de la macroeconomía, teoría monetaria, economía del trabajo, historia del pensamiento económico e historia económica, temas sobre los que también ha escrito extensamente. Ha publicado más de 125 artículos académicos en revistas científicas o capítulos de libros y ha sido autor o editor de una docena de libros. También ha editado o coeditado unos 45 números especiales de revistas. Muchas de estas publicaciones son de carácter interdisciplinario y abarcan diversos ámbitos de la economía política. Ha sido profesor visitante en varias universidades de Francia y de México y participa regularmente en el debate político tanto en Europa como en América del Norte. Entre otras actividades, desde 2004 es editor del International Journal of Political Economy. En 2017 recibió la medalla sesquicentenario del Senado de Canadá en reconocimiento a su valioso servicio a la nación y por la calidad de su trabajo académico en el campo de la economía heterodoxa y por su apoyo intelectual a la comunidad. Y en 2021 recibió el premio John Kenneth Galbraith de Economía del Foro de Economía Progresista por sus amplias contribuciones al análisis económico heterodoxo combinadas con su compromiso con la justicia social. Y nuestra comentarista, que es de casa, doctora Claudia Maya. Ella es doctora en Economía por la UNAM, maestra en Economía por la Universidad de Missouri, Kansas City, y maestra en Finanzas por la Facultad de Contaduría y Administración de la UNAM. Pertenece al Sistema Nacional de Investigadores Nivel 1 y fue responsable del proyecto PAPIT, Reconfiguración Bancaria, Circuitos Monetarios e Innovación Financiera. También es autora del libro Financiarización, Securitización y Crisis, la experiencia estadounidense, del 2020, y de múltiples artículos y capítulos en libros en México y el extranjero. Ha participado en diferentes coloquios y seminarios nacionales e internacionales. Actualmente se desempeña como investigadora titular aquí en el CISAN y es profesora de la licenciatura y posgrado de la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas y Sociales. Bueno, la verdad es de que podríamos decir muchas más cosas de tanto del doctor Seccareccia como de la doctora Claudia Maya, pero la intención es escucharlos aquí de viva voz. Entonces, por favor, adelante. So please begin when you feel comfortable. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Sorry, here, okay. Is it, okay. Thank you very much. And also thank you, Claudia, for inviting me. And thanks to Alicia, of course, who brought me here, literally even now, okay, my car, okay. So thank you so much. It's truly a pleasure to be here. And also because it's been almost, in a month or so, it will be 10 years that I was last time at CISAN.
Yes.
In March of 2016, I was invited. And it was, again, thanks to none other than Claudia here. Okay, so honestly, I'm very honored to be here after a decade of, how should I say, exclusion from Mexico. Well, you know, I actually, the last time was in 2018 I came here, because then after that, you know, COVID and everything else there. And forget, you know, I'm just saying it was sad, you know, what happened over this last decade. And also because we lost some very important people from here that I really am most saddened about. But I must say that it's at a, okay, I'll put it right here. Okay. Is that okay? Could people hear me now, or? Okay, get closer. Okay. So I'm just saying that it's an absolute pleasure to be here. And I hope I will not disappoint you, because I am really, I mean, I know Carney. I actually tried to, I've written even to him on certain things, but I don't know him personally. I cannot pretend to know him at that level. But I have followed somewhat his career, and especially since he became governor of the Bank of Canada, okay? But let me say a little bit about Carney, because, you know, I should give a bit of a, what's the term, you know, his curriculum, so to speak, here, you know, what who he is and what he's about, you know. First, he was born in a kind of, there are not that many people there, in the Northwest Territories, which is a territory right in the north towards the Arctic Circle. So that is not someone who comes from the big cities, you know, like Toronto or whatever, Montreal, so Vancouver, whatever, in our case, someone who was born there from a family of sort of middle class, because the father initially was a teacher, school teacher. And then his mother, too, initially she was at home taking care of the kids. But more importantly, she also at some point studied and went back and got a job in teaching. But the point is that she and he, the father, eventually moved to Alberta, Edmonton. And so in a sense, he is more of an Albertan. And it's important to understand that because of the dynamics of the politics of our country, because Alberta stands out in a very curious way. Why? Well, we have huge regional differences. I would say even more than Mexico, okay? Why? Well, because if you go from east to west, you have not only differences in terms of culture, but linguistically, and also in attitudes that have origin both in the history of each region. In what sense? In terms of the industry that developed, in terms of the actual natural environment, because they're so different. Okay, I mean, if you go from just on the Pacific coast, you have, you know, mountainous and whatever, you know, in British Columbia, and then you go to Alberta, Saskatchewan. These are prairie. You know, if you go there, it's flat. You know, you will see the horizon very far. Okay, to say that it's very different environment, even physically, very different, and it also leads to a certain attitude towards things. For instance, the Albertans are more cowboy-like type of people. Okay, more like the Americans, I would say. In fact, I would argue they're the most American of the Canadians. And it's not by accident that just recently, because they have this, I won't comment on whether it's a good or bad thing, but there's one group that is pushing for sovereignty, for independence of Alberta. And just last week, it became a big scandal because, of course, what they did, these idiots, basically, the way I would say this, because truly it's unbelievable. And in fact, some were accusing them of treason, which is that they went to Washington and asked for both political and financial support for their cause of independence. Okay? And obviously, both Trump and Scott Bessent in particular commented on that, okay? Supporting them, which obviously provokes, you know, I mean, it's like putting the flagging, a red flag in front of the bull at this point, So you could see with all the insults that these people are, I mean, it's not for nothing. And part of that follows from the Davos talk as well recently. Okay, so we'll get to that. But what I'm saying is that he comes from a region that is more cowboy-like, let's call it, okay, an attitude. As against if you go eastward, Ontario, Quebec is French-speaking, very different culture, okay? But and also there's issues about independence there, history. And we've lived that for generations, literally, but there's still Canada there. It's still there, so to speak. And what's important, though, is that in the case of Carney, while he grew up and studied in Alberta originally, he, in fact, holds 3 citizenships. Okay? He is a citizen of Canada, of course, is where he was born. I actually have 2, by the way, okay? So many Canadians tend to have more than 1 citizenship, as a rule, almost. But in the case of Carney, he has both the citizenship of Canada, the citizenship of Ireland because it's an Irish descendant, but also because his wife is British. And obviously that's why he became, as we figure out, he became the governor of the Bank of England as well, okay? Because of his British citizenship that allowed him to do so, thanks to his wife, who's British. Okay, so you could see the kind of figure we're dealing with as someone who's clearly comes from a kind of very secluded almost an environment in the Northwest Territories, but then slowly opens up to the world. And he has had what I would call a stellar career, really, in terms of, compared to, let's say, Justin Trudeau, okay, who was a high school teacher. This guy has gotten to do a lot of interesting stuff, okay, at very high places in the world, okay. Now, now what did he do, this guy? Well, he's although his background is in economics, he has, in fact, he spent 13 years at Goldman Sachs. Okay? So that tells you. Now that, by the way, is sometimes what you need in your CV to become a governor. Because if any of you know, in the case of the European Central Bank, okay, Mario Draghi was also a Goldman Sachs employee for a long time, as an example. Okay, so it's one of those routes where you kind of get to know the financial world. And he had worked in about 6 different, places with Goldman Sachs, like even in Tokyo to whatever, to Europe and so on, Britain. And he clearly had, he had that initial career, which allowed him, I would say, to first enter into the public service in Canada at the federal level. It opened doors for him to a certain extent, and he became Associate Deputy Minister of Finance before he became the governor of the Bank of Canada. And of course, he also was the governor of the Bank of Canada from 2008 to 2013. Then jumped across the Atlantic pond, as we say sometimes, because it's getting closer in a certain way. And he became governor of the Bank of England from 2013 to 2020, which includes both the Brexit period and also the starting of COVID, okay? Now, then he came back to Canada, and he took up positions in all kinds of, he was chair of, Brookfields, there are these very major financial investment kind of financial enterprises. And I mean, if you didn't get very rich with all these governors' positions, he certainly did with being in the private sector. So in that sense, he's some would would say, yeah, he's certainly very well endowed, okay, financially as well. Although he came from a very modest family. Now, as you know, in March, he replaced Justin Trudeau. Remember, now we're kind of jumping a little bit here, but he was a consultant to Trudeau, advisor, all kinds of stuff. He was president, but never did he say he wanted to be a prime minister or replace Trudeau. And until the end of 2024, not too long ago, he was, of course, we never heard that, we never thought, okay, really. There was no necessary, and there were people in the party who liked him and maybe would have advised that, but nobody did that because, after all, we have a sitting prime minister. But as you know, Trudeau got into a number of problems, okay? And Trudeau became very divisive at some point. Now, not necessarily for bad reasons. This is something which I think we have to be careful about. He for one thing, there was all this debate, especially during COVID, that he became very divisive about. The idea, because you have people who were anti-vax, don't wear masks, all this sort of stuff. In fact, during that whole period, we even had a whole convoy, okay, that for 2 weeks, they paralyzed the city of Ottawa at the time. Okay, all these trucks coming in, these 18-wheelers, blocking things, and, causing a lot of havoc until they were told to out, that they were literally forced out eventually, or they would all go into jail. And but during that period, in fact, I thought he was very tolerant because, and people of Ottawa, especially in the center where they blocked and near the parliament and all that, they were very tolerant, honestly. But it's true. They had the right to protest, but not to close down the city or part of it. So there were a number of things that went on there. And why was he so divisive? Well, there were some very good things he was trying to do. For instance, on the question of Aboriginal rights, he was very committed to making changes there. Okay, he our first and only prime minister who called himself a feminist. Okay, just to show you. But for some of us who are, I think, more progressive looking, that doesn't sound necessarily bad. But not everybody thinks that way. Okay, so I'm just saying here that he became very divisive, and also because as we came out of the pandemic, as here too, I'm sure, okay? Once you start seeing inflation picking up, especially after the beginnings of the Ukrainian war, okay? What we start seeing is that the conservatives consistently attacked the government for problems of affordability, okay? And problems that are caused by the deficit, by the way, which is complete nonsense, okay? And the reason why, if anybody looks at what was going on, yes, we had a big deficit in 2020, huge deficit, comparable, it actually probably even more than the US as a shared GDP. Because he responded not so much just with dealing with vaccination, all these things, but more importantly, because we provide a huge support through their emergency funds that were set up. For instance, not only through the unemployment insurance system we have, where they were dealing with those who were connected with, as I said, were formal employed, but even, we don't have much of an informal economy in Canada, like in Mexico at all. But there are a lot of independent, producers, if you want to call them that, independent entrepreneurs and so on. And they all were given $2,000 a month at the time, okay, in 2020 to survive, okay? So even if, even though they had never contributed to insurance system or anything. So we spent a lot of money there, okay? And it was good. I think it was a good thing, not bad, okay? But of course, the conservatives says, oh, the deficit exploded. It's true, it exploded in 2020. But as a share GDP, it declined consistently after that. And there was no inflation. The fear was deflation initially, okay? The fear was deflation. If you look at the data on the price, the consumer price index, let's say, whatever you want to look at, you will see that the inflation rate was almost zero, okay, in 2020. And it's only once the economy started to pick up. And what happened, we know, of course, because there were all kinds of problems, supply chain problems, I mean, we're dependent on foreign trade. So again, depending on China was locking down there rather, as late as 2022. Okay, so you could see why there were all kinds of problems, which led to problems of prices as the economy started to grow again. We started seeing that there were problems on the pricing front. Now, they blamed that on Trudeau because he was in place. But which I would say I would agree, because he could have done something like instituting price controls or something. There could have been certain things he could have done. He didn't do those things, obviously. But it led the opposition at the time to attack him for these things. And in fact, the leader of the opposition, there's this fellow by the name of Pierre Poilievre, who attacked him. And let's call it that the wins in 2024 were in the sails of the Conservative Party of Poilievre. That more and more people were turning towards that party, okay? So in a sense, it looked, remember, Trudeau was the head of the Liberal Party of Canada. It was a minority government supported by the NDP, the New Democrat, or Social Democratic parties. And thanks to that, in fact, thanks to that kind of almost implicit coalition during that period, that they introduced all kinds of really interesting social programs. Okay, I mean, we have since 1965, universal health care, quote unquote, but we also have child care. Okay, we introduced like $10 a day child care we had drug care that they started to introduce, and so on and so forth. They started these things thanks to the support of the NDP as a condition for them to maintain the minority government throughout that period, from 2021 to 2025. But it was the Liberal Party that was in power. I mean, it's just the way it is. Actually, historically, most of the I would call progressive programs were always because of that minority situation. So it's not because it's inherent in the Liberal Party to be more progressive. No. But it's because of that pressure and threat that you get a lot of interesting programs, including, let's say, universal health care, going back to the 1960s. Okay? So it's very important to understand the history of our country on that basis, because it didn't come easy. Now, of course, at the time, Trudeau was in trouble, and eventually, we say it metaphorically, he took a walk in the snow in January, and decided that maybe it's time for him to leave after 10 years, practically, in government. And then came the issue, who's going to replace him? And eventually, of course, it was a very big majority, like 87% or something, that voted in the Liberal Party now as leader, Mark Carney, in March of last year, not even a year ago. And of course, what we know is that the Carney is a very different animal, so to speak, politically, than Trudeau. Trudeau, as I said, is more flamboyant and more, all kinds of, as I said, very feminist, whatever, all these sorts of things that, in a sense, that more conservative people don't like, okay? And what happened, Carney was more businesslike. You could see him more wearing a pinstripe suit, okay, than a jumpsuit like Trudeau or whatever. What happened was that he seemed to have a little bit more solid background in his way of talking on the economy because of his credentials. I mean, there's no question. Trudeau did not have the same credentials. Okay? Needless to say. For instance, he was seen as a very good central banker, and he was also important at the time in success. Okay, as an asset manager. Okay, which for people like me, I may not even trust them so much. Okay, but for the general public, this guy knows what he's talking about. You think, right? So there's that facade, and indeed, as an aside, I should say that Carney was the first governor of the Bank of Canada after Louis Razminski. Now, Louis Razminski, I'm sure none of you have heard of him, or I don't know unless you study the history there in Canada. Louis Razminski was our delegate to Bretton Woods in 1944. He was he headed the Canadian delegation during the negotiations under Bretton Woods in 1944. And Louis Razminski became a governor of the Bank of Canada in 1963, 62, I might make a mistake here, until 1973, if I remember correctly. Okay? And he was the last of what I would call as a kind of almost Keynesian, okay, to use the term here. Let me take a bit of water. I'm sorry that I get a dry mouth very quickly here. He was the first, he was the first one who seemed a little more different than the others that we had since 1973, okay? Because after 1973, our governor of the Bank of Canada went monetarist. And we had all kinds of problems. I mean, I will not even start to explain the whole thing there. But what I'm saying here is that for the first time, there was almost a bit of fresh air. Why? For a number of reasons. By the way, when he was governor, he said that he sympathized with the Occupy Wall Street movement. It's kind of interesting, He also, because he was still governing in 2011, okay? Also, I remember in one of his speeches, I don't go around reading all these speeches, but I remember one that stuck in my mind. He, at the time, remember, it was right in 2008, okay, at the time of right deep in the global financial crisis, when he became governor, I think in 2007. So in 2008, he's trying to manage a ship. Okay. Now we didn't have the problem. By the way, I should mention, we never had a bank failure or anything. We never had problems like that. Not because of Carney, but because of our system in place. By the way, okay. It's a different banking system, a very different banking structure than the U.S. Now we could get into, if you have questions, I'm happy to discuss them. But I'm saying because of that, there wasn't much of financial crisis. Most of it came from outside of us. So we were being hit by that because, there is a kind of financial integration under NAFTA and all that affected us, okay? But not because we were somehow doing something wrong. We didn't have subprime kind of stuff. They were pressuring us from the U.S., okay? But our Canadian banks, because they were more conservative, so to speak, okay, and less pressure because they're more concentrated, more monopolistic, they didn't go that route. They still want to make money, but I remember, for instance, I think it was the president of the Toronto Dominion TD Networks, a bank, okay, where he said, No, we don't. Like when they were pushing to have these subprime, he says, no, I would not sell these assets to my mother-in-law. Meaning that if I cannot sell it to her, I don't want to smell it, but I don't want to hear about it. Okay, and Toronto Dominion is one of those, because not only did they survive, but in 2008 they bought up so many American banks, and in fact, I think it's 4 or 5 of the top 10 North American banks are Canadian. And a lot of that arose because of the financial crisis. Okay, so they just bought them up eventually at fire sale prices, okay, at the time. And so you go to New York, you see TD banks, you see all, or whatever, these, Bank of Montreal, BMO, whatever. All of those are because they're big banks to begin with in Canada. They were solid banks, and they just bought up the others, at the time. So, but also, as I was trying to say about Carney, there was a big debate during the financial crisis. Should we spend more, deficit spend a lot, all this sort of things. And at the time we had Stephen Harper, who was very conservative kind of guy, okay? So Carney had to convince him, because Carney was supporting deficit spending, more Keynesian type deficit spending at the time. And in fact, if you read one of his speeches, he is the only governor who referred to what we call in economics the paradox of thrift. I do not think many of you know that, okay? But it's the idea that if we saving, let's say I save as an individual or household, it's good that you save because you could then build up a capital in a sense. If you want to buy a house or whatever it is, right? It's a good thing. But if collectively we all save, it shrinks the economy, right? So what applies to the individual unit does not apply to the whole economy. It's one of the first things we learn in macroeconomics, okay? If you didn't study it, so yeah, I wish you could study it. But I'm saying that it is clearly, okay, Carney, who was saying that, he says, no, if not, we'll end up with the paradox of thrift, meaning we'll all try to save more during the recession when you got to spend, right? And that would just make it worse. In fact, what Keynes, this is a famous Keynes kind of argument, which is that if we save individually, you could save more. But if we try to save collectively, we'll end up saving less because you'll shrink the economy, okay? So this is Carney. I'm saying he's someone who is not heterodox, very mainstream, as we're going to see in a minute, but a kind of more ambivalent one, okay? Sort of mixed in terms of his tendencies, and understanding policy issues, okay? And of course, and needless to say, so last year, he not only took over, but then he went through an election campaign last April and got elected. But it was a minority kind of situation. So he's still relying on the other parties to support him. So it's a delicate balance. Okay? For instance, for critical issues, he must get the support of the House. They cannot do like Trump decide, okay? Like the king. Well, so you need to get the support of the House here, what we call the Parliament, okay? The House of Commons. And what happened, of course, is that the NDP was really badly affected. The Bloc Québécois, which is the separatist party, if you want, but they have been supporting him until now. Okay, and he, of course, has been able to maintain himself in power for how long we don't know, because if things go out of whack a bit, he will be back in campaigning, so to speak. Okay? But what's important here is that here's someone who was completely out of the picture. If you go before Christmas, let's say in 2024, and then all of a sudden becoming the prime minister by April, okay? And Pierre Poilievre, who was expecting to be coronated almost, okay, because he was clearly, the winds were in his direction. He did not win, but he won by Carney, and in terms of parliamentary vote there, he won by only a small margin. In fact, he has to get this because there are 2 seats still to give him a majority in the House. Okay? The way it works, we have like the British parliamentary system. It's not like in the United States, let's say. So unless you don't know, we are in the parliament, you need to have the majority, the relative majority, to be in power. But in this case, he has the relative majority, but not the absolute majority. So he needs the support of a third party, okay? Because he needs those 2 extra votes somewhere. 2 extra people are going to vote for his budget, as we're going to see in a minute. We'll talk about. Okay, so that is, so here's what in Canadian politics is termed a blue grit. That is a quasi-conservative in many ways in economic policy, and liberal, very liberal on the social policy front. Okay, in terms of whatever, many social issues that we could talk about, they were all very, I mean, gay marriage, anything that is seen a little more, questionable for the more conservative, people, he would be very much in the liberal sense of it, okay? Now, the conservative aspects of his policies were implemented immediately when he came into power, okay? In fact, when he didn't even go through the elections and became the leader, he already made changes because automatically when Justin Trudeau had left, he replaced him as the leader, and therefore de facto, he was the prime minister, so to speak. Although he was never approved by the people of Canada, for Parliament, but still, he became officially the premier in March, before the elections in April. And already then he made some changes, which I'll just mention a couple of things here, okay, which are important because it created a lot of, let's call it hostility within the left of the Liberal Party. Okay. First one is that he removed the carbon tax, but on household consumption only. So we had a carbon tax in place, a very sophisticated one, for environmental, quote unquote, issues, a carbon tax that still applies for business. Okay, so that didn't change, but for households, he eliminated to deal with the affordability issue. Okay, in terms of inflation and all that. That's the excuse he gave, for sure. And that peeved off some of the people within his own party because the more environmentalist types, one of his ministers quit at some point. Okay, Stephen Guilbeault, his name is, for instance. And also, okay, another thing he did, Trudeau had introduced we had a capital gains tax before, but it was 50% of capital gains would be taxed. Okay, and he raised it to 60%, to 2/3, Trudeau. When Carney came in, he brought it back down to 50%. Now, that again turned a lot of people off. Why? Because, capital gains is unearned income, the way I see it. I mean, if you treat it better than you treat if you earn a salary or whatever, okay, there's a problem. Okay? And of course, now, in some places, they don't have it zero even. Okay? If you go back 50 years in Canada, they don't even have a capital gains tax. But it's important, that one, because it encourages speculation, turnover, like in the housing market, for instance. So if you're not taxed, you could flip over the houses many times. and make capital gains without being taxed or being taxed at 50%. Why should that be 50%? But if you work for your living, it will be 100%. You have to be taxed fully for that salary. Okay? So you could see the problems that raises, as an example. So you could see how that, but he also did other things, like increase the rebate, the GST, the goods and service, the consumption tax here, what we call the goods and services tax. Okay, he increased the rebates for households, especially in a kind of sliding scale. And the poorer you are, the better the rebate. Okay, so there were some good things that were more on the progressive side, if you want to call it, but there were other things that were not. So you could see where he's at. Okay, he's more businesslike, more ambivalent on certain things. However, the two most important initiatives that he took now were on both the internal and external trade policy, let's call it. Okay, with especially shifting trade alliance. Now, this is something that he was pressured to, but I think he had to do it for sure, which is, of course, once you get Trump attacking us, and so until, in fact, initially he started with these, I think they applied also to Mexico, and somebody reminded him, yes, but you signed an agreement called the USMCA. You can't just start slapping. So you had to find excuses. Remember, in our case, now, I must say, from Mexico, drugs go into the United States much more so than from Canada. You know, and he attacked us because Canada was allowing fentanyl to go into the United States. When in fact, if you look at the amount involved, I think it was some ridiculous amounts, like you put in a bag for the whole year, okay? And it was like 1% of the total that comes into the United States. But he attacked us for that. And because our border was too porous, he said, you know, you could easily let in people, okay? So at the time, there were certain responses to that, obviously. But we initially, what we did is, okay, we're losing our trade with some, because as you know, after he did that, he withdrew that. But then he started to attack certain sectors that they were deemed strategic, military, like the automobile or, you know, especially aluminum, steel. Now, lumber, which I don't know what's the strategic military of cabinets. You know, if you buy a cabinet or something, or desk, you know. But nonetheless, they attacked that. And obviously, we had to respond in some ways. Now, we initially did respond already when Trudeau was in power. But he kind of pulled it back. Because at the end, what was going on was that we were shooting ourselves in the feet as well. Okay. Oh, okay, perfect. I'll just get to the main things. So one is that on the internal trade, they tried to eliminate barriers. I'll give you a simple example. Beer, if it's produced in Quebec, will be easier to ship it to the US with free trade than to ship it to Ontario, because it will be, you know, so there are all these things that existed there, okay, that they've been trying to eliminate a bit. Not completely. And some of that I don't think they should eliminate. But nonetheless, they were trying to do. But that's easy. I mean, as a way to increase demand internally, basically. Okay? The second thing what he did rather, was to try to shift, let's call them trade alliances, towards Europe and Asia. And we're seeing that, you know, as you know, we have a free trade deal agreement with Europe, and he's pushing for more changes there and integrating not just the European Union, but also these other countries to the east that are not part of the European Union, and also, of course, on the Pacific side. So there's South Korea and China as well, which was the big one that has created the most problem recently. Okay? So, but all over the world, he's been trying to expand connections there in the Gulf region even, and so on, okay? In attracting both more trade but also investments and so on. However, the most interesting is what I would call is hybrid Keynesian fiscal policies that he put in place. In the last budget, and I actually know it very, because I spend the whole day locked up. We have a lockup for journalists to comment on the federal budget in Ottawa. And I was one of those locked up for that, because they put you in, they say, we'll give it to you early in the morning so you could read it carefully and comment once the Minister of Finance gives his speech. Okay, so I read very carefully his budget of November of 2025. Okay, and it's an interesting one. It's a contradiction, though, and I'll tell you why, and I'll explain the problem. I am very familiar with, I know none of you are, probably, or very few, with what Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, used to say wrote about in the late 1930s and even during the war. Keynes was in favor of what he called the socialization of investment. Okay? Now that sounds like a fairly radical concept, right? Actually, there are two policy measures in the general theory, and they're all long-term. One is a socialization investment. Guess what the other one was? He was in favor of the euthanasia of the rentier, okay? Meaning very low interest rate policy, because rentiers, he didn't see them as useful, people who just survive by, acquiring from their financial wealth, whatever, their incomes. But in the late 1930s, there was this whole question of what did he mean by the socialization of investment? And what it came to be, mostly. Now, there are different interpretations. But the one that some economists were defending, like Richard Musgrave, one famous economist of that era in the public finances, he proposed that we divide the budget, okay, into what we call the operating or ordinary budget from the capital account one, if you want, the capital budgeting. Now, all of you may not be at all familiar what this means. But what it means is that if the government wants to, let's say, do the grocery for the restaurant and parliament, okay, I'm being facetious here, but hire civil servants or whatever, that's part of the operating account. It's like the consumption of the state. If instead it invests in building roads or bridges, things like that, seaports, it's the public investment side of it, right? So what did he do? He, for the first time in our budgeting, not that it's a new idea because it was known since, as I said, 1930s literally, he introduced capital budgeting as well within the budget. So, and he basically argued, a bit like Keynes at the time, that we shouldn't worry about the deficit of our capital account. Okay, sorry. In other words, no problem, spend, okay, almost. Not ad libitum, but certainly spend a great deal. Do not feel constrained with that. Why? Because it's an investment from which we get a real return, okay? Well, in the operating balance instead, Keynes himself said, look, he didn't think it was important to be concerned about, of course. But because why? He said, if you're running a deficit in your operating balance, this is Keynes, okay? If you are running a deficit in your consumption balance part, your operating balance, it's because you're not doing enough public investment to generate enough growth in the system. Okay? Well, Carney got into that, but I think he played to the conservatives at some point. And what he did is, yes, really no constraint on the capital budgeting part. But when it comes to the consumption side, the ordinary budget, we must target a budget balance. Okay? Now, it's true that if you have very high growth, it will generate even a surplus in the ordinary balance as well. Okay? But he's gone the wrong way in the sense that I think it was to really appease and get the conservatives off his back, okay? Because he's in a minority government situation as well, to give them that to bite on, that, he's going to try to deal with the deficit. But it's the ordinary deficit, not the capital account, okay? And therefore, what we have is a kind of bizarre, it's sort of, it's being half conservative, half liberal. Like, for instance, they're planning to remove 40,000 jobs in the federal public sector. That's a lot. But jobs through attrition, he says, meaning that they will not fire anybody. But with the turnover, they will eliminate the jobs, the vacancies, okay? They will disappear. So here's an example that peeved off a lot of people. Why? Because he was elected in a riding that is in the Ottawa area, where they're all civil servants. So you could see why that's very risky. But what we have is a kind of Keynesian austerity almost measure, which is really half-baked. So here's the public finances. I'll stop there because I'm way over. Okay.
Very interesting, Dr. Seccareccia, what you are mentioning, especially trying to understand the background of Carney. In the one hand, he is trying to apply some Keynesian kind of Keynesian policy, but at the same time, I'm thinking about this euthanasia of rentier, since he is a rentier, or he was.
Oh, yeah.
So,
yeah, but he still works. Yeah, working frontier.
designing monetary policy.
Yeah.
In the last, from the last few months, I have followed the development of Canadian economy, and particularly trying to understand what kind of economic policy is being implemented with Trudeau and with Carney. I have observed that it's the same. Because the report that the monetary policy reports from Bank of Canada, they say the same. No, they have been very responsible with the budget.
Yes.
They have been trying to target inflation around 2%, and they are trying to keep interest rate low, around 2.5. This last report.
Yes.
So it has a complete effect on the economy and the performance of the economy. The economy by itself is not growing as much as they
Yeah, we're being hit badly in industrial.
To the class and the course you were doing, it's like trying to okay, interest rate is a income.
A variety of interest income earners, yes.
So how can you reconcile that this speech of this man that was or is a banker and trying to expand the budget or spend more with the result or with this kind of policy implemented that obviously going to affect not just few but the majority of people. And I would love to listen to you. How interest rate is an income.
Oh.
Income. But
it's not only a cost, yes.
Why?
Wow.
Because I have heard many people saying that Carney is by far the best prime minister that Canada can have. Because he knows about economy, he knows how to run a bank, so he can know how to run economy. And because in general, Canada could be much more benefit
a great deal from that.
Yes, from his background. And I'm not that sure. He's playing like two roles.
Sure.
And
absolutely.
I would like to hear that.
Okay.
And the other thing,
Think I better write it down. Okay.
why targeting inflation to this interest rate can harm the economy and people. It's not a good thing just trying to restrain inflation by itself. No?
Okay, that's easy one.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, but
Okay. Actually, I've been giving lectures on exactly that.
so no matter what, but
Mhm.
it has a high social cost.
Yeah.
So please.
Okay. Now, if I remember the others, because I started jotting down now the last few, but for sure, first of all, it's true that he has the credentials. But for some of us who are more cynical about economists, he may have credentials that I will feel very uncomfortable about. Why? Because these are friends in high places that often don't give a damn about the population, you know. I mean, I'll give you an example. He worked as the chair at Brookfield,
Goldman Sachs? No.
not Goldman Sachs originally, but after he came back, after becoming governor of the Bank of England, he became back into investment banking kind of stuff. Okay, so they make so much money. It's the one. It's actually the one he was chair. Is it Brookfield? I think it's Brookfield. Whatever it is, it doesn't matter. I'm just saying it's one of the biggest ones in Canada. Okay. And they engage in all kinds of investment, you know. Now, what that tells me that he was working for, it's like the rentier class almost, you know. He's working for those people who had all these capital assets and they managed it for them, okay? And to me, I mean, sure, you got to be smart.
Yes,
You know, you have to be
it's
very
not
good
at
at
all.
it, okay? Very skilled. But skilled to do what is the issue, okay? And when you put these guys at the head of a government where they have to look at the public interest in a sense at large, not just that of, you know, of the rentier kind of a situation, then you could see why it could become a problem. So I think that let's call it curriculum, you know, CV that he has there, it's both. I think it's very interesting, and it's a plus for some things for sure. Okay, very skilled, you know, person, but also one has to be taking some of that more cynically and say, well, yeah, but what was he doing all the time? Okay, even the central banks, what are they exactly? What role do they really play? Okay, in setting interest rates and all that. And if you read the report of the Bank of Canada, in a sense, I would say you're reading the wrong thing here almost. Why? Because he was himself, you know, governor of the Bank of Canada. So you're not going to get another governor of the Bank of Canada saying bad things about a former governor who's also the prime minister now. Okay. So you're not going to get too much good things, you know, that in a sense would come out of that would be more honest, I would say. Okay. But so in a sense, I would be a little more careful to take what he says with a grain of salt. But you're absolutely right that he has accepted all the basic, like for instance, inflation targeting, you know, 2%. Everybody, it's almost like when you go to church and you repeat the same litany, okay? They all repeat the same litany. Even if people wonder, like myself, whether they are able to achieve that even, okay? But we could get into that. We've had 3 days of classes where we've discussed many of these things, by the way. So but I could certainly spend a lot of time. I could spend the whole evening talking about it. Yeah. Now I'm being facetious, but I could tell you, okay? But for sure he has accepted the inflation targeting stuff. But it's not such a great thing. Why? I'll just say this much. As you said, interest yes, it's a cost to, let's say, if you borrow money, right? If you borrow, you're going to pay whatever, right? Whatever it is. Let's say 5% in Canada, maybe, or even lower now, the prime lending rate, okay? because it's 2.5, the overnight rate.
Mhm.
And what I'm saying here is that, yes, it is a cost. So you want to get that down, like Trump is saying, okay? But it also will squeeze the rentiers because there's an income side to it. And what is inflation targeting all about? Inflation targeting is that every time the inflation rate goes up above 2%, let's say, okay, outside of the band that we have, what will happen? The central bank starts to inch up to raise its interest rates.
Mhm.
Now, what does that do? Well, it does two things. It could have an impact on the economy because of spending effects. So the idea behind that is that you're going to raise unemployment. You'll slow down growth. Raise unemployment to slow down what? Primarily wage growth, right? Wages and prices at the end, okay? What does that mean to you now? If you're a rentier, you are benefiting two ways. One is that you're protected against inflation because every time they see the inflation going up, they'll raise interest rates proportionally or even more than proportionally. Okay? So that will increase or stabilize your rentier income. At the expense of whom? Of the working people mostly. Okay? By creating unemployment. What kind of civilized policy is that? Okay? You could ask. Some would say it's not a very good policy way of dealing with society. There are better ways to control inflation than hammering over the head of working people. And then even worse is cutting their capital gains tax at that. I'm saying you could see why it's a problem. And that's why we were saying, in fact, in the classes in the last few days, that monetary policy is an incomes policy. Okay, very important. And I'll just tell you this story and then I'll take other questions. But I'll tell you a story. I was involved. I've said that already to the class, so there's a few here who are familiar with that. But I used to, I was trying to influence the government. We met with the original, at the time, the former Minister of Finance, not the current one, okay? And also the Vice Governor of the Bank, Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada, a woman by the name of Carlin Wilkins at the time. This is in 2019, before COVID. And what we tried to do was trying to get them to broaden the mandate because the current mandate is simply, very simple, which is 2% target we have to meet, okay? And if you can't, you have to do everything to be able to do it. And what could the bank do? Raise interest rates, okay? Which is not good for the economy. And more importantly, as Trump says, but more importantly, it's good for the rentiers though, okay? So what I am saying here is that at the time we met with them, and at the time we met Carolyn Wilkins, I remember starting and saying that your policy is not neutral on the income distribution front, okay? It's not. I said it's a bad way of addressing issues. And you should have, at the minimum, a dual mandate, not just 2%, but at least even the US has a dual mandate officially. There should be price stability and full employment, okay? But also you should be monitoring income distribution, especially the income distribution that you impact on, which is the relation between rentier and non-rentier income. At the time, that's what, and you know what our response was? We are neutral in our policy. And I said, well, how could you be neutral? Every time you raise interest, you're raising the income of some people. How neutral could that be? See the problem? So that's why it's an incomes policy. I don't know if that answers.
Yes. Well, actually, I want you to explain us that. But the other very important question on how Carney is dealing with trade.
Yeah.
Trade.
Yeah.
So
In what sense you're trying to say in trade? Obviously, as I was trying to say earlier, he's redesigning our trade links. Okay? I mean, for obvious reasons. I mean, if you have a guy who says, we want to destroy your automobile industry, I mean, you have to understand, we had an automobile industry in Canada 100 years ago or so. We had a kind of domestic one. Over time, for obvious reasons, we are a small economy in comparison to the United States. Over time, automobile was bought up, the producers, by American, General Motors or whatever, Ford and so on. They were bought up. So we ended up having a lot of American cars being built in Canada, though. Okay? And we originally negotiated, some might know if you study a bit the history of that in Canada. In 1965, we signed the Auto Pact. Some of the students that were there, I talked about it already. The Canada-US Auto Pact. Okay? What was it? Well, in simple words, it was, I mean, there's a complex side to it, but in simple terms, every time you, let's say, sell a car in Canada, which is American, remember, these are like General Motors or a Ford that were just like here in Mexico as well, right? But the Auto Pact said that every time you sell a car in Canada, you must produce one as well in Canada. So it was an industrial policy. And it was a very simple but precise industrial policy. And they were able to follow that until when? Until 1989. No, with the Canada-US free trade agreement. Then what did they do? They eliminated that because the FTA then replaced, and then NAFTA as well, right? So that eliminated, but obviously there were no threats of tariffs or anything else. But I was there in 1980s when Brian Mulroney then and Ronald Reagan and his staff people were negotiating their first Canada-US free trade deal. We wrote in 1987 a declaration, a bunch of more, let's say, left-leaning, let's call it heterodox economists. There were about 75 of us who signed it at the time in November of 1987, and we sent it to the newspapers and all that, the media. And what we showed there, almost one by one, all the problems we're facing now under Trump. Because we said, first thing, and there was a whole fight during the election. In 1988, we had a free trade election, basically, which debated that issue. And the liberals then, under John Turner, the fellow who lost against Brian Mulroney, he was saying that we were making us very vulnerable to the whims of the US economy, in a sense. And look at what's going on there. You cannot get worse than this, okay? Because we are dealing with a nutcase, basically, who could just push his way, bully his way as he wishes. And feels he can because we are now captured by that. When you got 3/4 of your trade with one country, it's very difficult to wiggle your way out of that, okay? So that's why. But at the time, we were not 3/4, by the way. And as I said, we had industrial policies that prevented that from happening. Now it's gone. And we're seeing the consequences of that. So Carney is responding to that now. But how do you respond to that? One is through public investments, and it's happening right now. Remember I said, in the budget, there's a lot of money. He says, but there's no constraint almost on that. And it's going into all kinds of things, including military spending, because we have to deal with the North especially. There are threats there. Not so much from China and Russia only, but also the United States. Because if he's looking at Greenland, well, he's probably also looking at us, okay? And there's Alaska, we're in between the two, okay? So you can see the problem here. And of course, okay, so one is public investments, a lot, huge, right now, okay, in order to try to sustain growth because we're being hammered, okay? And, of course, trying to redesign trade internationally, including reconciling with countries that that Trudeau had a lot of problems for all kinds of reasons, which I don't blame Trudeau for, by the way, with China, because they did something, and it was the fault of Trump in the first Trump that we got into this trouble with China, because we didn't want that. They asked us to arrest Huawei, I think she was the daughter of the president of the Huawei, and he and we did that because we have an extradition also treaty with the United States, because they were accusing her of trying to trade with Iran and there's a whole thing about that. And Trudeau kind of naively went ahead and arrested her. And then also we got the two Michaels, we call them, that were arrested subsequently and spent 3 years in jail, okay? So there were all kinds of problems that arose because of that. It created a lot of friction with China, okay? And now Carney is trying to backtrack a bit there. Okay, and because China also slapped all these we went with Biden on slapping tariffs on EVs, electric vehicles, and following Biden. And I didn't think it was such a bad thing, personally, because it was a kind of industrial policy issue. Okay, but now he's allowed the imports of some vehicles. It's a quota system. Okay, and that was now approved. Yes. Oh, okay.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to add that when I heard Carney discourse, I had this feeling of being ambivalent. And later on, I was thinking on where the ambivalence was, but I thought it was a huge contradiction on what he was saying, which reflects all what you are saying now in his economic policy. And I think that this is kind of perverse strategy to try to be with liberal but also conservatives. And if in this contradiction, if one is going to lose, it's going to be a society. Because in contradictions, always there are always a certain population losing. So now I understand much better what he was saying in Davos.
Yeah, I mean, it's contradictory, as I said, because on the one hand, he's cutting civil servants. Well, on the other side, he's saying, let's spend money on the military.
Yeah, sure.
So you could say, well, now this doesn't sound like a very good social policy, maybe. But it's true that we are under a lot of, Canada was, I think, the lowest of all the NATO countries practically in terms of military spending as a proportion of GDP. Okay? And you know what Carney did? He actually did a smart thing last year. Okay? I mean, on the military side, because what he did, remember, some of you might know this. I mean, we used to be, I think it was 1.3% of GDP that went into the military. Okay? And under NATO, quote unquote, commitments that they're asking, it should be at least 2%. Now they're pushing to 5% even. Okay? But 2%, what did he do? He raised the salaries of all the soldiers. And it went up to 2% right away.
Okay.
So.
Okay. Thank you very much. Muchísimas gracias por tanta claridad sobre temas tan complejos. Y vamos a abrir el piso, el micrófono, para quien quiera realizar alguna pregunta, dudas, sugerencias, felicitaciones. El micrófono es de ustedes. Por favor, un segundito.
Thank you very much, Professor. Hello? Again. Thank you very much, Professor, for the nice presentation. All of us who deal with international affairs are very worried about the crisis of multilateralism. And I would like to ask you about the panorama of the Carney's government regarding the bloc of North America. because 30 years ago, when all these value chains were happening with the FDI in the automotive industry in North America, it was being discussed that, well, the European Union was moving to Euro, right? And then it was discussed whether the second biggest group behind the European Union was North America. And now that scenario seems so far away.
Mhm.
So I would like to know what your opinion that Carney government might do regarding the North America, the North America region as a bloc.
Yeah. I mean, it's obvious that we have been completely integrated on the North American side, I would argue. Too much almost, okay? When you have 3/4 of your trade with one country to the south and locked in, because it's more than just simply, you say 3/4, what does that really mean? You know, if we're just selling tomatoes or potatoes or something, you know, but you have a whole chain links, okay? Huge, and not just in the automobile sector, okay? In many industries, you see that, okay? All these supply chain links go both ways there, a lot of times. So it's a much more like it's a dominating form here, okay, of integration, in a way that it wasn't just simply, okay, we sell, you know, like in the 19th century or something, you know, trade. This is a very different type of trade links. It's high integration, okay? Which is not the case with any other countries in the world, okay? We have since 2016, if I remember correctly, I stand corrected on the exact year, but it's about 10 years ago. We negotiated CETA, which is the kind of the Europe in free trade agreement, okay? And the problem with that one was that it had to be approved by every country individually, because you know Europe is not a federal system or something, okay? So it's been a complicated process. I'll give you a simple example just to show how it's difficult, because I have family there in Wallonie, in Belgium, okay? In our case, you know, in Liège, let's say, where, so the French side of Belgium, remember there's the Flemish people there, and there's the French people, it's a bit like Canada, you have these bilingual, you know, country. And Belgium was, they were pushing the parliament to approve it, but it was blocked by the Wallonie sub-parliament, let's call it, you know, of the French side. And it was blocked and blocked for a long time, okay? And therefore, there are countries that clearly have free trade with us, but others that are not still, today, after 10 years. I think. I stand corrected how many, okay? But you have this problem of dealing with these countries. And also because if you want, clearly, take India, take China, you cannot really plan very much with them because they do not abide by trade in terms of the usual rules at all. In what sense? Well, the case of China is just an example there. Because of something that she did apparently that was breaking the law, in this head of the, you know, as we said, they're the big tech companies, that led to a response of them just arbitrarily arresting people, Canadians, okay? And that just created havoc. India is the same thing. We had the Indian government accused by Trudeau of killing Indians in Canada, having literally an assassination squad that went to British Columbia and killed the Sikh who was pushing for the independence of the Sikhs in India. All these things, so they don't play by the same rules that you could see here, okay? It really is a problem there. And with some of these countries, especially these very big countries that are very important on the trade front, we have to be very careful how we tread, you know, along that. And it's a big problem. So in that regard, I could see why Carney is trying to spread it much more. He's gone Well, he's going to go to India soon, I think in March. But he's gone to China. He's trying to deal with the big ones, but he's also trying to deal with the small ones. And with Europe, it's been long going because we already have a free trade deal that Canada signed. But the Europeans, they signed it, so to speak, but they had to get approval by the local governments, literally, that takes forever, okay? So that's as a good example of how things could become complicated. But I think I certainly cannot blame him for wanting to expand. Now, he's walking on eggshells a bit, okay? Best example is with China right now. He's being attacked by many politically for selling out to China, including the American president, literally, okay? Now, what the hell did he really sell off, okay? Well, you know what he did? He did something which I think, personally, I don't, like, I'm not for totally opening up for the EV. I believe that you have to protect, if we're not as advanced, you know, in North America even, not just Canada, okay, in the EV production side. So it's like, we call that in economics, the infant industry argument in favor of protectionism, okay? And to some extent, what Biden was trying to do was a little bit of that, okay? So I did not blame Trudeau then, personally, for wanting to try to protect, you know, the production in North America, so to speak, okay? But the problem now is we get Trump who says, remember, these are American companies established in Canada, but their huge supply chain, all the parts, it's big. I mean, it's a big industry. It's much bigger than you could imagine, okay? And that sector now, he wants to destroy completely. So, I mean, should Canada go on protecting American companies in Canada so that they could then destroy us further? I mean, you know, you cannot accept that. It would be lunacy, you know? And what did Carney do? He said, okay, we're not, you know, we don't want to destroy we still want a free trade deal. We want to try to go back to this, but we're going to allow through a quota system, okay? It's not opening up the market completely. It's a quota system, okay? And for next year, he has agreed to allow 49,000 EVs from China, okay, BYD, whatever these companies there. And by the way, we import already, you know, Elon Musk, you know, he produces it in China too, but they're coming in free trade. But why not BYD then? Let's say the Chinese companies. I mean, it's completely absurd, some of this. And what Carney was trying to do there, which I don't blame him for, was first, okay, let's try to open up, because we had to deal with all these retaliatory tariffs on our agricultural sector, our fishing, whatever the other sectors in Canada that were being destroyed, literally, as well, by the Chinese, because it was such a big market. And, you know, like the canola, you know, oil, canola grains and lobster industry, whatever, you know, they slapped 100% taxes on all that. Therefore, you could no longer sell it there, okay? And you're competing with the Americans, which is another problem, okay? So he was in a difficult position there to try to deal with with China in this case, for instance. And what did he do? I think it was strategically correct, which is we'll start with a quota. It's not a big one. 49,000 EVs is less than 3% of the total sales of automobiles in 1 year in Canada. Okay? It's significant, but it's not going to destroy our car industry. Okay? So one is that. Okay? And what he's trying to do is trying to get maybe the Chinese car producers to start production in Canada, just like we did with the Japanese, you know, Honda, whatever, all these. We've done that going back to the 1970s or 80s, okay, when we opened up trade with Japan, let's say. Because then it was the same problem. We had all these cheap Japanese. I'm old enough to remember, how cheap they were in comparison. Okay, and we're trying to do the same thing, which is to create jobs as well, while welcoming them to be able to sell their products in our country. But it's very difficult. I mean, it's a very difficult dilemma because you got a guy who says it explicitly, I want to throw a bomb almost on your automobile sector. He wants to destroy it because we don't need your stuff. So obviously, what the hell are they doing here, these American companies do? Why? We should even have them there. Why should we protect them?
Muchas gracias.
That answers a bit. Okay.
Tenemos tiempo para un par de preguntas breves, por favor.
¿Por qué no las juntamos?
Sí.
Y después que las...
We are going to get together all the questions and then
Oh, okay.
give
Oh,
you the
boy, that's
space.
good. Okay.
Please.
My memory.
Thank you. No worries.
Yes.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank you so much for this special explanation about so many aspects of the microeconomic inside Canada. Honestly, I have so many questions to do about that, but I would like to remark that inevitable we are inside the framework of geopolitical aspect. We as a North American region, in this direction, I'd like to emphasize that we have no choice. We have to play in team, taking paying attention that the United States is in the middle of the crisis. Your government, your society, as a Canadians, and we as a Mexicans, we have to be close together. And even in that case, it's not going to be an easy task. But at the same time, of course, as the last intervention, we have to play with the other giants, as you already mentioned, like China and India. This is inevitable. We don't know exactly what's going to happen, but I think that we have to take care to take actions about immigrant movements, for example. We as professionals, we have to be so close connected. I mean, universities like this, UNAM, other national institutes, related with the universities from Canada and also from the United States. But also the other immigrants. I mean, we have a lot of power that we have to be focused on it. You know, workers. We even have an agriculture treatments, I think. And all those details have to be on the table in the middle of the negotiation. And I think this could be one step forward in this direction. This is what I came to attend this dialogue.
Muchas gracias. Una más, si es que alguien más tiene alguna duda.
Yes, I have one.
What is?
Yes.
What is Mexico?
Okay.
All this?
One second.
Okay, well, that's...
Yes.
Hi, Mario. Once again, thank you for your presentation. I think it's awesome what you have presented us today. And I really have not just 1,000, but I really want to know, what do you think about the measures the Carney government is taking to address Canada high food inflation?
What creates?
Inflation?
Oh, inflation.
Yes, food inflation, sorry. And how effective are these measures like to be? For example, not just food, access to housing, which is very interesting
Yes.
topic.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir.
Sure, that's that easy.
Okay.
Okay.
I think there's one. Creo que hay una más. Una y con esta cerramos. Gracias.
Thank you. Do you think that Canada must have a strict policy to Arctic issues in terms of international policy?
Could you repeat?
Arctic-
No, I
Arctic-
understood
Arctic
that,
policy.
but what is the question exactly? What do I think about the Arctic
The
policy?
Arctic position
The position of Canada?
of Canada
Oh,
right
okay.
now, because I'm not sure what is going on
Oh, okay,
with
okay,
Arctic.
okay, Arctic
And
policy. I don't know if I can
perhaps
answer it well, but I'll try.
the international policy is wider in terms of Europe or in terms of hemispheric position. So
Mm.
perhaps what to decide that Canada will decide.
Yeah, okay.
Go on, please. Thank you very much, Professor.
Okay, I'll try to answer all of you in some way. I hope I understood them well too, because sometimes they were more like comments here than really questions. Okay, but I will attempt to address them. Okay, now I'm gonna, well, obviously, okay, we have no choice. I mean, what can I say? We are living with an elephant in the room. That's the usual analogy. And especially when you're sleeping with one almost, okay, it becomes very difficult to maneuver, okay? Because it just shakes a bit and we could get hurt. So I'm just saying, yes, we have to. And how do we do it? I think Carney is one who will try to establish greater links with Mexico than any of our former prime ministers. I think so. I believe so. Because we are being identified, I try to isolate ourselves, okay? And I think that's where the opportunity arises. In the past, we were kind of two solitudes almost, right? Until NAFTA, okay? Then, of course, comes Trump into this picture. And a good example is, some of you may have followed, because it was the first time in the history of the G7 meetings. In the case of last June, in Canada, we had I'm sorry, okay. In June last year, at the Canada meetings there, the G7, he invited, clearly he wanted to, Sheinbaum to that meeting. I think that's probably the first time that they invited someone from Mexico, okay? Which I think is very important, okay? Why? Because Trump was there, and he wanted him to note that they are two now or more who are standing up. And it was giving the signal that there might be more cooperation. I think there is. I don't think I ever remember, look, I didn't pay attention to that in the past too. I'm an economist who are looking at different things, but I never saw so many times now that are different ministers coming both ways, coming to Mexico, for instance. We never had so much of that as we've had in the last 6 months or a year, okay? So in that regard, I think it is almost, how should I say, Mexico to me is in the picture for Canada. And indeed, there are certain areas, especially in the area of building up seaports. Carney is trying to, part of these public investments strategy is to build up infrastructure that could allow us to be able to have greater trade between the two countries outside of the United States. Because everything now goes through the United States, basically. Not just because physically it's through railway or whatever, but more so because, I could buy grapes from Mexico, but they go through California. So when I look at it, it says made in in Mexico, whatever. But then, guess I see there California, whatever, Cynthia. Somebody is intermediating. Okay? Why should we? Okay? And we could easily do that through sea ports. A simple example. Okay? Because obviously we got the US in between there. Okay? And we, as we say in Canada, we are attached at the hip, with the United States. So it's clear that how do we get out of that? And they're trying. I think there is a lot of visible signs of that intention. And also in the area of immigration. I mean, we have been also on the receiving end, but for Mexicans, it's much further north and muy frío, as they say, mucho frío, whatever is the term. Yeah. I'm saying that there is, it is a problem, but we get a lot. And one of the areas where there's been problems, long-standing problems, is in the area of temporary workers coming from Mexico to work, especially in the agricultural sector. They come during the summer, they help in the production of all kinds of stuff, that we produce. I mean, we produce, you'd think that it's a cold country. We produce even in winter. I buy tomatoes from Canada in winter, as an example, because we have the technology to do that. We don't need California for a lot of things, okay? Obviously, we don't produce avocados, I'm saying, or pineapples, because it would be too expensive to produce. Not because it's impossible, but it's too expensive. But for certain products, we could do it. We don't need the United States even, okay? And people don't realize that to what extent, okay? So I'm just saying here is that there are issues that are longstanding and that will inevitably, hopefully, I would like to argue, will be ironed out somewhat. But there's, I think, a lot of good intentions because we are facing the same problem with the elephant in the room, okay? So that's the first thing, yeah. Now, for the other question, Maria there about inflation and housing. Look, I mean, there was a study done, it's not much of a study here. They got to check to see the curriculum of all the members of parliament, okay? And over half of them have other real estate possessions, right? They have several. Pierre Poilievre had a real estate company, share it with other. So do you expect that they want to address the housing problem? They're making money out of it. Okay, I'm being facetious here, okay? So if most of them are in fact, they have more than one dwelling, let's say, or have several and are gonna rent out, and some of them have really completely real estate companies, do you expect they're gonna be concerned about that? So I think what I think Carney did, though, I'll say that much, good for him, but I don't think it's going to happen much, okay, honestly. But I think during the election, he defended that we should do big investments in housing as comparable to what happened after the Second World War. And why is that important to understand? Because immediately after the Second World War, when all these veterans who were fighting in Europe at the time, okay, many Canadians died in Europe, but especially many that were coming back, the government of Canada gave them all a house to live with their families. They built small houses. Some of them you still see now. Most of them, they were very cheap houses, obviously, okay, with a lot of land, actually, but relatively speaking, okay, even where we live there's still some of these old veteran houses that were built after 1945. And in fact, he started to show when he was, campaigning, You saw in his messages, like on television, whatever, in the videos there, you saw him showing how they were building at the time. And he was arguing that now we have much more modern ways of prefabricated houses and so on to be able to really expand a lot very quickly, the production. Now, he is pushing that. It's part of these public investment kind of goals. But I don't know how far he's going to go. I think he was, let's just say, more of a sales job than what he could achieve. Okay? But this is one area, again, where in the housing sector, which is the most critical problem of affordability in Canada. It's not just inflation. Yeah, the price of wheat or whatever, price of bread has gone up. But it's mostly the housing that has been the most difficult, really. And that one is driven by speculation. Remember that. And what did Carney do? He cut the capital gains tax, which is the worst thing to do. So that's where he's contradictory. Okay? He wants to build more houses, but then he cuts that because maybe he has real estate himself. Okay? So I'm just saying, this is a problem. Okay? And what can I say? They should not vote people who have real estate because they're not going to vote in favor of, reducing housing prices. That's it. Okay. So that's my answer for that. I think understand. Now, the final one, let me see if Arctic policies. Hold on. See, that's a really, I won't say $1 million question, but it's a difficult one here because, of course, we took Canada, and I'm not, as I said, I'm an economist, so I'm no expert in international relations and all that. But I could say this much, is that we took, and Carney has said it too in a sense, right? We always took the Arctic to be a kind of natural barrier that would never lead to problems. The last time we had a problem, I can remember in the 80s, I can remember exactly when, but I remember this, okay? I could find out exactly. I think it's in the 1980s, but I stand corrected. At the time, we had a conflict between Greenland, or Denmark, in a sense, and Canada over an island between our two countries. It's some stupid island that is a tiny island. And you know what they did? We sent the army there, but we sent a minister as well. And Denmark sent their minister. They each traded a bottle of whiskey in our case, or whatever, Canadian whiskey, okay? And they drank it, and they said, we split it down the middle of the island. That was the end of it. There was not a fight over it, okay? We didn't have a war over that, okay? Because who the hell, really, there's nobody on the island, there's nothing. It's a piece of ice. No, but we saw that as a natural barrier, okay? And now there are threats. As I said, the threat is not only the more belligerent, like the Russian or even the Chinese, but it's the Americans too. Because they want to take over Greenland. Which other island do they want to take over? I'll give you an example. Until recently, in recent years, we used to see, again, the Northwest Passage, which is a very critical passage. Remember, before the Panama Canal, they had to trade from Asia, let's say to Europe, they had to go either around South Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, or around South America, on the other side, in order to be able to travel and trade, let's say, export, import goods. Now came the Panama Canal. But never, there are many navigators going back to the 16th century who tried to go through the Northwest Passage. Most of them failed. I'll give you an example. Hudson. I was mentioning that at the lunch today. We were talking about this issue. Okay, I'll just stop. Let's just finish this thing, which is that Hudson's, Henry Hudson, the Hudson's Bay, It's named after the guy and they died. There was a whole bunch of navigators who were trying to go through, but they blocked, and then winter came and they just froze there, literally. And they just recently found where that ship sank. Recently. Why? Because the waters are there's ice is melting, and the waters are now more navigable. Okay? So they exposed some of those ships that sank there. Okay? Just to show you that there is in this case, that whole area in the north of what we call the Northwest Passage, let's say to China and so on, or Russia, is now opening up a lot more. And obviously, the United States, it does not recognize the sovereignty and the authority of Canada over that Northwest Passage. So it's not the Chinese, it's not the Russians, it's the Americans who do not recognize. Okay? The Chinese, they were telling, oh, we want to do a research, and they asked permission at least for the Canadian government when they go through the Northwest Passage, but not the Americans. And we put up with that, basically. But it's clear to us that this is a region of Canada, not a region of the United States. But we have to defend that. Okay? And we're trying to do that in the way we've been pushing now for for Greenland to be respected as a region, autonomous region of course, in this case, Denmark. But so there's been all kinds of attempts. I mean, I don't even know where to start. Setting up now, a consulate in Greenland, things like that, in order to stand up basically to Trump. Yeah. But it's
Muchísimas gracias por el tiempo, la paciencia de todos, de nuestro expositor, pero también de ustedes que nos están acompañando hoy. Juntos hacemos estas discusiones mucho más interesantes en estos tiempos tan complejos. Entonces, sigamos dialogando, sigamos discutiendo y muchas gracias al CISAN por estos espacios. Gracias.
Thank you. That's why I've been drinking water.
Para los asistentes que deseen constancia.